Princess Anne had entered the late Queen's private archive, expecting nothing more dangerous than fading correspondence and forgotten family records. Instead, she emerged carrying a sealed letter bearing her mother's handwriting, and a warning addressed directly to Charles. Within an hour, the Princess Royal was standing outside the king's private study, demanding answers about a royal instruction he had deliberately kept from the family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had been reviewing Queen Elizabeth II's private papers at Windsor when an envelope stopped her. It was marked, "For Charles, to be shared with Anne if my final request is not honored." The private archive, a collection of royal letters and family records, preserved material too sensitive for public release. Yet this letter had no matching entry in the official log. She opened it. The instruction inside: Charles was to appoint her independent guardian of the monarchy's private family archive, giving her authority to stop records from being altered, concealed, or removed. This was not an honorary role. It was a safeguard, created because her mother feared the crown might one day place control above truth. Anne's shock hardened into betrayal. Charles had received the order months earlier, yet he had never spoken of it. Palace officials under his authority still controlled every file, letter, and decision about what could disappear. The Princess Royal understood that silence had not been accidental. Someone had chosen delay, and that delay protected the king. Charles learned of the discovery through a documented call from his private secretary. He closed the folder on his desk, dismissed his aides, and said nothing as the room emptied. The king knew which letter she had found. He also knew the handwritten addition below could not be explained away. The monarch had written that family loyalty may one day be confused with obedience to the crown. Anne read the sentence twice. Her mother had anticipated this clash between her two eldest children and left a warning sharp enough to survive her death. Then Anne noticed the missing royal registry number, the tracking code used for important palace documents. Its absence meant someone had deliberately erased the letter's official trail after the Queen died. When the private secretary asked for the envelope, she tightened her grip and refused. Charles would hear the words from her directly: no aides, no witnesses, no protective language. But before Anne could demand why her mother's final instruction had been buried, she had to confront the deeper truth. Charles had far more to lose from the letter than a moment of embarrassment. To the public, Charles and Anne represented two unshakable pillars of the same royal generation. Behind closed doors, however, they had carried duty in profoundly different ways. He inherited the crown and its power. She inherited the expectation of service without control. Now their mother's letter had placed those unequal burdens on the same table, and neither sibling could retreat without surrendering something deeply personal. Charles had spent his reign pulling authority toward the center, convinced that a modern monarchy could not survive if several relatives held competing power. The crown, meaning the sovereign's legal and symbolic authority, demanded one clear voice in his mind. Yet that belief had slowly turned every challenge into a threat, and Anne's discovery struck at the heart of his rule. The king gripped the arms of his chair as his private secretary explained that Anne had refused to surrender the letter. He heard the words without interruption, but his silence carried anger. If his sister controlled the family archive, the private collection of letters and records shaping royal history, she could question decisions he had kept beyond scrutiny. Anne felt none of the triumph Charles feared. She remembered standing beside her mother during one of their final private conversations and promising to protect the family from division. That memory cut through her anger. Confronting her brother now felt like breaking that promise, yet remaining silent would betray the woman who had trusted her to keep it. William learned through a recorded call from the king's office that a private instruction from his grandmother had surfaced. Before the prince could contact Anne, Charles ordered him to stay out of the dispute until the monarch had handled it himself. William obeyed for the moment, but the command left him uneasy, because his grandmother's final wishes were no ordinary family matter. Camilla soon heard that the letter concerned authority over the archive. She entered the study after the secretary left, and asked whether Anne would be allowed to review her private correspondence. Charles looked toward the closed folder and gave no answer. The queen consort understood at once that the danger reached beyond his control. Old choices, hidden tensions, and private exchanges could all fall under his sister's protection. Anne paused outside the study and unfolded one final page she had kept from the archivist. The handwritten note explained why the queen no longer trusted the existing arrangements, and the reason was painfully specific. Anne read that final warning again, knowing it would change how she entered the room. And the reason for that distrust led back to one bitter royal ceremony, when a private order from the queen vanished before Anne's eyes. The crisis had not begun with a hidden envelope. Its true origin lay 18 months earlier, during a private Windsor ceremony meant to honor the late queen's longest-serving household staff. What should have been an evening of gratitude became the moment Anne realized her mother's wishes could be quietly rewritten. One missing name, one altered speech, and one closed door created the fracture now threatening the king. Shortly before her death, the queen had approved a private Windsor recognition ceremony for 6 longtime household employees. The ceremony was a formal gathering held to honor service inside the royal household, and she had personally dictated every name. Anne had reviewed that list beside her mother, so she knew exactly who had been chosen and why each person mattered. Then one name vanished. During the ceremony, Anne discovered that retired dresser Margaret Rodeswell had been removed after refusing to surrender private wardrobe records to Charles's transition team. Those records mattered because they contained handwritten notes, personal instructions, and details capable of showing how the monarch's wishes had been handled during her final months. Anne moved quickly. She confronted the Lord Chamberlain in a side room and demanded to know who had changed the list. The senior official, responsible for overseeing the royal household's ceremonial work, lowered his voice and said the decision had been authorized at the highest level. He then closed the door, leaving her with only one possible meaning: Charles. Charles later called the change administrative. In a documented private exchange, he insisted the removal had protected sensitive records during the transfer of power. Anne heard the explanation, but she had already seen Margaret waiting outside the hall with tears in her eyes, still holding the handwritten invitation issued in the Queen's name. That single image turned suspicion into something colder. The newly discovered letter now confirmed what Anne had feared. Her mother learned of Margaret's removal and viewed it as proof that her private instructions were being filtered through the future king's household. The Queen therefore created the independent guardian role, a position requiring Anne's second signature before any family record could be erased, hidden, or transferred. Anne reached the study with that truth burning beneath her grief. This was no longer about whether Charles had concealed a letter after their mother's death. It was about whether he had defied her while she was still alive, then hidden the evidence once the crown became his. And Anne knew his answer would change everything. The door opened, the aides withdrew, and for the first time since Charles became king, Anne faced him not as a loyal sister, but as the keeper of their mother's final accusation. There were no courtiers, no advisors, and no prepared statements when Princess Anne entered the king's study. She placed the letter between them, but did not sit. Charles looked at the familiar handwriting, then at his sister's face, and understood that denial would be useless. What followed was not a constitutional debate. It was a family reckoning decades in the making, compressed into 4 devastating words: "You knew her wishes." Anne closed the door herself and laid the Queen's letter beside Charles's red government box. That box, used to carry official state papers requiring the monarch's attention, now sat next to a private command from their mother. Family duty and sovereign power had been forced onto the same desk, and neither could be moved without consequence. Charles admitted he had received the instruction. He claimed he delayed it because dividing control of the archive during the first year of his reign would have caused confusion, weakened order, and invited rival centers of authority. The king spoke carefully, but his sister heard calculation beneath every word. Anne pushed the letter toward him. She accused him of hiding disobedience behind transition problems and demanded that he read the final paragraph aloud. Charles refused. Then she spoke Margaret Rodeswell's name, and he rose so sharply that the chair shifted behind him. The anger revealed everything. In a documented private exchange, Charles confessed that he had removed Margaret from the Windsor ceremony because she copied private papers without authorization. Anne answered that their mother had personally approved those copies. The retired dresser had not betrayed the household. She had preserved the Queen's instructions from being quietly rewritten. Anne unfolded the unlogged final page. The monarch's warning was direct. Charles must never use accession, the formal moment when a new sovereign takes the throne, to cleanse the past of inconvenient witnesses. He stared at the sentence as though it had reached across death to accuse him. Charles removed his glasses and placed them carefully beside the letter. His voice dropped. Their mother, he whispered, had never understood the pressure he would face as sovereign. Anne did not soften. She told him the Queen had understood completely, and had prepared for it. Anne demanded that her appointment as guardian be announced within 24 hours. Charles refused, warning that a private letter could not override the authority of a reigning monarch. The words landed coldly between them, but his sister did not retreat. But Charles's crown did not give him unlimited control, because the Queen had placed a second copy of her instruction beyond his reach, and another royal already knew where it was. Charles believed the argument remained contained within one locked room. Then Anne revealed that the letter on his desk was not the only copy. The Queen had anticipated resistance and deposited a duplicate with a family trustee whose loyalty could not be commanded by the crown. Suddenly, the king was no longer deciding whether to honor his mother's request. He was deciding how much damage refusal would cause. Anne told him the duplicate had been witnessed and placed with Sir Andrew Harcourt, chairman of the Royal Family Records Trust. The trust was a private body, responsible for protecting family-owned papers rather than government documents, which meant Charles could not erase its authority with a royal command. His power was immense, but here, it had a boundary. Sir Andrew confirmed the arrangement in a documented telephone call. The Queen had ordered him to act if her original instruction remained ignored. She had also created an enforcement clause, a written condition that would activate the guardianship automatically once Anne and one confirming witness signed after a formal refusal. William was summoned without warning. He entered expecting to mediate between his father and aunt, only to learn that his grandmother had named him as that witness. The prince read the signature page twice, then lowered it slowly. Supporting Anne could look like a judgment against Charles. Refusing her could bury the Queen's final safeguard forever. Charles saw his hesitation and pressed harder. He told William that signing would tell the world the king could not be trusted with his own family's history. The future king chose his words carefully. Ignoring the Queen, he replied, "Might tell the world something worse." Charles turned away, but the answer had already struck. Camilla soon discovered that several sealed files from the early years of her relationship with Charles fell inside the archive Anne would control. The Queen consort asked whether those papers could be opened. The king promised nothing, and her quiet fear revealed how deeply the letter reached into their private past. William stood alone in the corridor holding the enforcement page. He uncapped a fountain pen and paused above the empty line. One signature could transform the balance inside the royal family. Then he heard Charles approaching and closed the pen before the ink touched paper. The king immediately called an emergency family meeting, determined to block the appointment before William chose. But Anne entered carrying a second folder, and the anger on her face had changed into certainty. She had found missing catalog cards, altered entries, and proof that archive boxes were already being moved. The debate was about to become an accusation, because Anne no longer suspected that records were at risk. She could prove that someone had started removing them. By dawn, the dispute had escaped the boundaries of a private family argument. 3 archive boxes were missing, 2 registry entries had been altered, and 1 royal aide had abruptly left Windsor without explanation. Anne entered the emergency meeting carrying the empty catalog cards in a black folder. Charles had hoped to contain his mother's letter. Instead, the attempt to delay it had created the very danger she had predicted. Anne opened the folder and named the missing collections: correspondence from the Queen's final year, records from Charles's household transition, and private notes concerning Camilla's future ceremonial role. A household transition was the transfer of staff, files, and authority from one sovereign's reign to the next. These papers mattered because they could reveal who had changed the monarch's final instructions and why. Security records showed the boxes had been moved shortly after Charles first received the letter. The authorization code belonged to the king's senior records secretary, the aide responsible for controlling access to sensitive royal documents. Charles stared at the entry, ordered the secretary found immediately, and insisted he had approved no removal. Anne did not accuse him directly. She asked whether the aide had acted on instructions or merely believed he was protecting the monarch. The question changed Charles's face. He understood that secrecy carried out in his name could damage him even if his signature appeared nowhere. Camilla sat alone after learning that her files were among those missing. When Charles entered, she asked whether Anne would be allowed to read everything. The queen consort feared more than embarrassment. Those records could reopen private choices that had shaped public trust for decades. The king gave no answer, and his silence left her exposed. Then a vehicle leaving Windsor was stopped. One missing folder was recovered, but every document inside had vanished. Only a small note remained, carrying the same registry number erased from the Queen's secret letter. The link was no longer suspicion. Someone had joined the hidden instruction and the missing files into one deliberate operation. Charles soon received a documented message from the absent secretary. "I followed the arrangement approved before accession." Accession meant the moment a new sovereign formally inherited the crown. The words suggested the concealment plan had begun while his mother was still alive. The king crushed the printed message in his hand. When William entered, he slowly flattened it against the table, trying to restore the dignity slipping away. The prince read the sentence, then asked Anne to meet him alone in the old music room. There, he promised to reveal what the Queen had told him during their final private conversation. Away from the king, the council, and the missing records, William finally gave Anne the one truth that could end the conflict or destroy what remained of the family's trust. There were no secretaries in the old music room, no files, and no royal titles spoken between them. William stood beside the piano, where his grandmother once waited before family dinners, and admitted that she had prepared him for this exact moment. She had not asked him to oppose his father. She had asked him to recognize when protecting a king meant preventing him from making an irreversible mistake. William told Anne that the Queen had spoken to him weeks before her death about preserving private records. She called memory the conscience of a family, meaning the truth that forces relatives to face what they have done rather than rewrite it. Those papers mattered because they carried private decisions that could shape public trust long after everyone involved was gone. The prince then revealed the warning that had haunted him. His grandmother feared Charles might treat disagreement as disloyalty during the fragile beginning of his reign, when every challenge could feel like an attack on his authority. She asked William not to deepen that isolation through automatic obedience. William's voice broke as he admitted he had resented the burden. He had avoided questioning his father about the archive because he feared discovering that the Queen's doubts were justified. The future king had told himself that silence protected the family. Now he understood that silence had protected the secrecy threatening to divide it. Anne felt her anger soften. Her mother had not burdened her alone. She had placed the same impossible duty upon William. Anne told him the letter was never meant to humiliate Charles. It was designed to stop concealment from consuming him until the crown became a wall between the king and everyone who loved him. Then William produced a short handwritten statement given to him during that final private conversation. The Queen confirmed Anne's appointment in direct words, destroying any claim that the instruction had been an unfinished thought. Her statement transformed the dispute from interpretation into intent. William signed the enforcement page, but he added one condition. Anne must protect every record impartially, including papers that might embarrass the people supporting her. The enforcement page, a document that activated the guardianship once both signatures were added, could not become a weapon for revenge. Anne accepted without hesitation. She took the pen and signed beneath him. Neither smiled. William folded the page once and said Charles deserved one final chance to act voluntarily. Together, They returned to the king, not to overthrow him, but to preserve their mother's wishes, without destroying his dignity. By the time the palace gates filled with cameras, Charles had only minutes to choose whether history would remember him as the king who resisted the truth, or the man who finally faced it. The private conflict became public before the palace could control its language. By midday, broadcasters were reporting an emergency royal meeting. Crowds had gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and every camera waited for a statement no one fully understood. Inside, Charles stared at the announcement prepared in his name. Outside, the country sensed that Princess Anne had forced the monarchy to confront something larger than a family disagreement. A leaked meeting schedule confirmed that Anne, William, Charles, and the records trustees had assembled inside Buckingham Palace. The trustees were the officials responsible for protecting the royal family's private papers, separate from state records. Their presence suggested an internal transfer of authority unlike anything the palace had faced before, and speculation spread faster than officials could contain it. Palace communications staff prepared two statements. One rejected the Queen's instruction as non-binding. The other formally appointed Anne as guardian of the private archive, giving her joint control over sensitive family records. Charles read both drafts in silence, convinced that accepting the second would make him appear weak when the monarchy needed certainty. William challenged that fear. He told his father that correcting a mistake publicly might be the strongest decision left to him. The prince was blunt. Refusing now would protect the king's pride, but it could destroy trust in his judgment. Anne drew her own line. She would not stand beside Charles unless he acknowledged that the role came directly from their mother. The Princess Royal refused to let the palace present the appointment as a generous idea created by the monarch after pressure mounted. Then the missing records secretary was found. In a recorded account given to palace investigators, the aide admitted that files had been removed under an informal transition policy created by senior officials. They believed embarrassing material should be separated before accession, the formal moment when a new sovereign takes the throne. Charles learned that no evidence proved he personally ordered the removals. Yet his relief lasted only seconds. By hiding the letter, he had allowed that secret policy to continue without challenge, and the damage now carried his silence. Outside Buckingham Palace, a newspaper vendor raised an evening edition above the crowd. Its front page declared, "Anne holds the Queen's last command." Voices faded, as a broadcaster announced that the king would speak within minutes. Charles picked up the approval pen, looked toward Anne, and asked for the original letter to be placed beside his signature. When the king finally lowered the pen, he did more than appoint his sister. He decided whether the crown would protect its image or accept the truth preserved by the woman who had worn it before him. Charles signed the appointment with Anne standing opposite him and William beside the door. No applause followed. There was only the sound of the pen returning to the desk, and the recognition that the late Queen's final safeguard had survived every attempt to delay it. The confrontation ended not with a royal victory, but with three members of one family finally accepting the cost of hidden truth. Charles formally appointed his sister as independent guardian of the royal family archive. The archive was the protected collection of royal letters and family papers. Anne now held joint authority over removals, restrictions, transfers, and future releases, ensuring that no household could reshape the past again. William added his confirming signature beneath the Queen's original instruction. His signature created a safeguard because future monarchs would need shared approval before altering the family record. His decision did not weaken the crown. It placed a boundary around power before secrecy became control. Charles then faced the public in an official statement. He acknowledged that his mother had created the role and admitted that delaying it had been an error of judgment. His constitutional position, meaning his formal authority as sovereign, remained intact, but the culture of concealment ended. Anne met him after the announcement. She told him she had never wanted humiliation or revenge. She wanted her brother to stop carrying the crown as though every disagreement were an attack. Charles listened, then returned the letter instead of placing it in his own files. The king closed Anne's fingers around the envelope and told her their mother had chosen correctly. In that moment, he finally gave his sister the recognition he had withheld. The missing documents were recovered, the unofficial transition policy was abolished, and the records secretary accepted responsibility in a documented statement for acting without proper written authority. Camilla's private correspondence remained sealed under the same rules applied to every living royal. Anne refused revenge and special treatment, proving the guardianship existed to protect truth, not punish people. The confrontation changed the monarchy because Charles accepted that authority without accountability becomes isolation, while Anne proved that loyalty is not silent obedience. The Queen's letter did not divide her children. It forced them to become honest with one another. The secret letter had begun as a warning from a mother who feared what power might do to her family. But it ended as her final act of protection, restoring trust between her children and ensuring that the monarchy's future would never again depend upon erasing its past. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.